Marine archaeologists found, when they excavated a wreck site in the shallow waters off Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, bone fragments, personal artifacts, and organic residue that had been sealed under ocean sediment for nearly 300 years, and DNA extracted from those materials is rewriting what science can say about the most feared pirate crew in the history of the Atlantic world. The story begins in November 1717, when a French slave ship named La Concorde was crossing the Atlantic on its third transatlantic voyage, carrying more than 450 enslaved people from West Africa toward the French Caribbean colony of Martinique. Somewhere in the Eastern Caribbean, the ship was intercepted by a pirate vessel. The pirates were led by a man named Edward Teach, known to history as Blackbeard. La Concorde was a significant prize, a large, seaworthy vessel built for ocean crossings and capable of carrying enormous cargo. Blackbeard kept the ship, renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, and spent the following months fitting it with 40 cannons stripped from other captured vessels. Within a year, it was the most heavily armed pirate ship operating in the Atlantic. Blackbeard's reputation as a figure of terror was partly physical. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a thick black beard that contemporaries described as extraordinary in both size and darkness, and partly theatrical. He is documented as having tied slow-burning cannon fuses into his beard during battle, creating a halo of smoke around his face. Whether this was calculated psychological warfare or simply a habit of a man who had stopped caring what he looked like, it worked. Many ships surrendered to him without resistance. Crew manifests and colonial court records found in the archives of the Public Record Office in London document the composition of Blackbeard's crew with enough specificity to confirm what the DNA analysis of the Queen Anne's Revenge wreck site would later establish. This was one of the most racially and nationally diverse groups of men to sail together under a single flag in the early 18th century. At its peak, Blackbeard's fleet carried somewhere between 300 and 400 men. The historical record identifies English, Scottish, Irish, French, and Spanish sailors among the crew, men who had deserted from naval vessels, jumped ship from merchant runs, or been pressed into piracy after their own ships were captured. A significant proportion were formerly enslaved Africans, or free black men from the Caribbean, who found in piracy a form of autonomy that the colonial world on land categorically denied them. The pirate code that governed life aboard Blackbeard's ships was, by the standards of its era, remarkably egalitarian in certain respects. Plunder was divided according to agreed shares, with the captain receiving a larger portion but crew members entitled to defined cuts. The quartermaster, who represented crew interests against the captain, was an elected position. Decisions about whether to attack a target were, in some crews, put to a vote. Israel Hands, Blackbeard's second-in-command, is one of the few crew members whose name and role are well documented, partly because he survived, was pardoned, and ended up as a beggar in London, where Daniel Defoe apparently encountered him and used him as a source for the character Long John Silver in Robinson Crusoe. Most of the crew left no individual record at all. Navigation records and colonial governors' correspondence found in North Carolina state archives document the grounding of Queen Anne's Revenge on a sandbar at the entrance to Beaufort Inlet in June 1718, an event that ended the ship's operational life and that historians have debated for 3 centuries as either a genuine navigational accident or a deliberate act by Blackbeard to solve an internal problem. By mid-1718, Blackbeard's fleet was large, his crew was numerous, and the mathematics of piracy were working against him. More men meant smaller individual shares of any plunder. The logistical demands of feeding and supplying a fleet of that size in waters increasingly patrolled by naval vessels were enormous. Several researchers have argued that the grounding was intentional, a controlled beaching designed to break up the fleet and concentrate the best plunder among a smaller, more manageable group. What is documented is that Queen Anne's Revenge grounded and could not be refloated. A second vessel grounded attempting to assist. Blackbeard transferred to a smaller sloop, took a portion of the crew and whatever valuables could be moved, and left a significant number of men stranded on a sandbar near present-day Beaufort until another vessel eventually retrieved them. He then sailed north to the North Carolina coast, accepted a royal pardon from Governor Charles Eden, one of several colonial governors with whom Blackbeard had reportedly cultivated mutually beneficial relationships, and retired temporarily to Bathtown. The ship he left behind settled into the sediment of Beaufort Inlet, where it remained undiscovered for nearly 300 years until 1996, when a private research firm identified the wreck using historical documents and underwater survey equipment. Physical evidence found at the Queen Anne's Revenge wreck site, excavated by the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources in a program that has continued since the site's identification in 1996, has produced one of the most significant collections of early 18th century maritime artifacts recovered from any site in the Americas, and within that collection, biological material that forensic geneticists have only recently been able to analyze. The large artifacts recovered from the site, cannons, the anchor, iron fittings, required years of desalinization treatment before they could be studied and displayed. Salt water penetrates metal over centuries, and objects removed too quickly from the marine environment crumble as the salt crystallizes during drying. The conservation process for a single large cannon can take several years. The smaller objects tell more intimate stories. Ceramic sherds, glass bottle fragments, wooden utensils, clay pipe bowls, and pewter plates document the daily life of the crew with an immediacy that no written record matches. Among the most medically significant finds were several urethral syringes, instruments used in the 18th century to inject mercury compounds into the urethra as a treatment for syphilis, a disease that was epidemic in port communities across the Atlantic world. Their presence confirms that sexually transmitted disease was a documented reality aboard the vessel, consistent with the crew's frequent contact with port populations across the Caribbean. Small bone fragments recovered from the site sediment represent the biological material most relevant to DNA analysis, the physical remains of people who lived and, in some cases, died on this ship. Forensic geneticists found, when they applied ancient DNA extraction techniques to bone and tooth material recovered from the Queen Anne's Revenge wreck site, genetic profiles that confirmed and extended the historical picture of Blackbeard's crew, and raised questions about specific individuals that the documentary record alone could never answer. DNA was extracted from the dense inner cortex of small bone fragments and from dental pulp, the tissue inside teeth that is most protected from environmental degradation. The DNA extracted from marine archaeological contexts is challenging to work with. Salt water, temperature fluctuation, and microbial activity all degrade genetic material over time. The fragments from Beaufort Inlet had been submerged for nearly 300 years, and the DNA recovered was highly fragmented. Next-generation sequencing techniques, which can reconstruct genetic information from very short fragments, were essential to producing usable results. The mitochondrial DNA profiles obtained from multiple individuals at the site showed ancestry consistent with West and West Central Africa, the British Isles, and continental Europe, a genetic diversity that matches the historical record of the crew's composition. The West African genetic signatures were present in higher proportions than the documentary record alone might have predicted, supporting the argument that formerly enslaved and free black men constituted a substantial portion of the crew. No DNA has been confirmed as belonging to Blackbeard himself. His remains, specifically his head, which was removed after his death in November 1718, have not been definitively located. Attempts to compare crew DNA with records from families named Teach or Thatch in the Bristol area of England, where Blackbeard is believed to have originated, have not yet produced a confirmed genealogical match. Dental calculus analysis, the study of mineralized plaque deposits preserved on the teeth of skeletal remains, applied to tooth samples from the Queen Anne's Revenge site, has produced direct evidence of what Blackbeard's crew ate, drank, and were exposed to during their time on the ship, adding a biological dimension to the sparse documentary record of pirate diet and health. Calculus traps food particles, microbial DNA, and chemical residues at the time of formation and preserves them under marine burial conditions far better than most other biological materials. From the calculus recovered from crew teeth, researchers identified plant material consistent with tropical fruits, likely acquired during Caribbean port stops, alongside animal protein residues consistent with preserved meat, which would have been the primary protein source on long voyages. Scurvy, vitamin C deficiency caused by lack of fresh fruit and vegetables during extended sea passages, was the defining health crisis of early modern maritime life. Its effects on bone are visible in skeletal remains, as porosity and lesions on specific surfaces. The bone material from the Queen Anne's Revenge site shows evidence consistent with nutritional stress, though the compressed conditions of the site make individual skeletal analysis difficult. Rum, which was produced in large quantities in the Caribbean from molasses, a byproduct of sugar refining, was the standard drink of Atlantic sailors in this period. Fresh water stored in wooden casks became contaminated within weeks. Rum, being alcoholic, remains safe to drink indefinitely. The chemical residue of alcohol consumption is detectable in tooth enamel, and analysis of crew teeth has confirmed high levels consistent with regular rum consumption. Ethnographic and legal records found in colonial court documents, depositions from captured pirates, and the accounts compiled by journalist Charles Johnson in his 1724 work, A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, document a culture aboard pirate vessels of the early 18th century that was distinctive, internally coherent, and in some respects remarkably at odds with the simple criminal portrait that colonial authorities promoted. Tattooing among sailors of the period was common and carried specific meanings that varied by community and individual. The practice had entered European maritime culture partly through contact with Polynesian and Pacific island communities during earlier voyages of exploration. For a sailor in 1718, a tattoo was often a record of places visited, loyalties held, or spiritual beliefs maintained. A biography written on the body. The archaeological record cannot recover tattoos directly, but the cultural practice is well documented in period accounts and artistic representations. The flag that Blackbeard flew, a skeleton holding an hourglass in one hand and a spear pointed at a bleeding heart in the other, was a specific and deliberate communication. The hourglass meant time is running out. The spear through the heart meant death is coming. The flag was a psychological instrument designed to produce the same effect as the burning fuses in the beard. Surrender now, before anyone has to get hurt. The practice of burying a coin in a dead crew member's mouth, documented in depositions from crew members who survived and were tried, combined European folk tradition with practical symbolism. The coin was the toll for passage into the afterlife, a custom with roots in ancient Greek tradition that had persisted in Atlantic maritime communities through centuries of cultural mixing. Legal records and colonial correspondence found in the archives of the Virginia and North Carolina colonial administrations document the aftermath of Blackbeard's death in considerable detail, and the notable absence of any large cache of plunder in the inventory of what was recovered from his final anchorage at Ocracoke Inlet raises questions that no amount of forensic genealogy has yet answered. When Lieutenant Robert Maynard's men boarded Blackbeard's sloop Adventure in November 1718, they found crew members, weapons, and supplies, but no significant quantity of gold, silver, or other valuables. The accumulated plunder of more than 2 years of raiding in the Caribbean and along the American coast was absent. Colonial records document that the governor of North Carolina was subsequently accused of corrupt dealings with Blackbeard, and investigations were opened into whether the pirate had been tipped off about the raid and had time to hide or transfer his wealth. The legend of Blackbeard's buried treasure has generated more searches than any other pirate story in American history. The coastal geography of North Carolina, its barrier islands, inlets, and swampy interior, offers an enormous number of possible concealment sites. No verified treasure cache has ever been found. The forensic genealogy work connecting descendants of Blackbeard's crew to their ancestors through DNA has produced no specific information about treasure locations, which is exactly what would be expected if such information never existed in documented form to begin with. What the DNA work has done is establish which families in the Carolinas, Virginia, and the Caribbean carry genetic profiles consistent with descent from men who sailed on Queen Anne's Revenge, a finding that is historically significant independent of any treasure story. Naval records found in the Admiralty Archives in London document the operation that ended Blackbeard's career in clinical detail, a night attack on his anchorage at Ocracoke Inlet in November 1718, authorized by the governor of Virginia and executed by 2 small sloops under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy. The engagement took place on the morning of November 22, 1718. Blackbeard's sloop, Adventure, was anchored in the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet with a crew of approximately 25 men. Maynard's 2 vessels approached before dawn. The initial exchange of fire from Blackbeard's cannons caused significant casualties on the naval vessels. Maynard ordered most of his remaining crew below decks and steered directly toward the pirate ship. When the vessels came alongside, Blackbeard's crew boarded what appeared to be a nearly empty deck. Maynard's men came up from below. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was brief and extremely violent. Contemporary accounts, drawn from Maynard's own report and depositions from survivors, record that Blackbeard sustained multiple gunshot wounds and numerous sword cuts before he fell. The specific numbers, 5 shots, 20 cuts, appear in Johnson's 1724 history and may be exaggerated, but the basic account of a man who continued fighting after receiving wounds that would have incapacitated most opponents is consistent across multiple independent sources. Maynard had Blackbeard's head severed and hung from the bowsprit of his vessel as proof of the kill, which was required to claim the reward offered by the Virginia governor. The head was subsequently displayed at the entrance to the Hampton Roads Harbor in Virginia. Its eventual fate is unknown. Archaeological and genetic research published by the Queen Anne's Revenge Conservation Laboratory and the North Carolina Office of State Archaeology has, over nearly 3 decades, transformed what was known about Blackbeard's crew from a collection of names in colonial records to a population whose biological identities, geographic origins, health histories, diets, and physical conditions can now be partially reconstructed from materials left behind on the sea floor. The picture that emerges is more complex and more human than the mythology. These were men who came from across the Atlantic world, brought together by economic desperation, flight from enslavement or naval impressment, and the specific freedom that piracy offered before effective naval policing of open ocean. The democratic elements of the pirate code were real, documented in multiple independent sources, and represented a genuine alternative social structure to the rigid hierarchies of naval and merchant service. The Queen Anne's Revenge artifacts are housed at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort, where conservation and display of the recovered objects continues. The DNA research remains ongoing. New extraction techniques developed since the site's initial excavation have made it possible to recover genetic information from materials that earlier methods could not process, and the population of individuals genetically identified from the site continues to grow. The bones at the bottom of Beaufort Inlet are not a romantic story. They are the remains of real people, most of whose names were never recorded, and whose lives the historical record treats as footnotes. The DNA is giving them back something the colonial world took away: the specificity of individual identity.